It started like any other Sunday evening in Brentwood. The sun had begun to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of a mansion worth $13.5 million. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Flowers were in bloom. The gates were pristine. Luxury cars gleamed in the driveway. But inside, darkness lurked. A darkness no one could have imagined. Rob Reiner, a Hollywood icon, beloved by millions, and his wife Michelle, admired for her warmth and grace, were about to become the victims of a family nightmare that would shock the nation. Imagine coming home to a place you've always felt safe, a home filled with memories, laughter, and the subtle hum of familiarity, and finding that every element of safety has been shattered. That was exactly the scene that unfolded in the Reiner estate on that fateful night. Their daughter, Romy, 27, would be the first to encounter the horror that had been quietly brewing behind the polished doors of her childhood home. And what she found would not just break her heart, it would reveal a sinister truth that no one wanted to face. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. How does a son, someone entrusted with love, respect, and familial duty, become capable of committing the unthinkable? The answer is complicated, tangled in years of private tension, hidden grievances, and shocking allegations that only came to light after the police and the FBI became involved. Nick Reiner, 32, lived in the guest house on the property. By all outward appearances, he was just another son trying to carve his path in life. But beneath that facade lay troubling behaviors, some subtle, others horrifyingly explicit, that would ultimately lead to a night of violence that would destroy a family. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner were found stabbed multiple times in their home. The brutality of the attack was a stark contrast to the serene, affluent life the family had publicly displayed. It wasn't just murder, it was a violent betrayal from within, a breach of the most sacred kind of trust. The authorities were alerted that evening, and Nick was arrested without incident. Charges of first-degree murder were immediately filed, but the story didn't end there. Allegations from the FBI would soon emerge, revealing an even more disturbing dimension: attempts to force Michelle Reiner into intimate acts by her own son. This revelation added layers of horror and disbelief, pushing the story beyond a simple act of violence into the realm of unspeakable familial corruption. To understand this tragedy, it's essential to look not only at the night itself, but at the family's history, the psychological patterns, and the hidden tensions that no one saw coming. Nick's behavior had raised concerns long before that Sunday. Friends and distant relatives recalled moments of aggression, manipulative tendencies, and disturbing comments that were often dismissed as quirks or youthful recklessness. Yet, when pieced together, these small incidents painted a picture that was chillingly predictive of the eventual violence. The Reiners were, on the surface, a picture of the American dream: wealthy, influential, and respected. Rob Reiner, at 78, had a career that spanned decades, directing iconic films and winning the admiration of audiences worldwide. Michelle, 70, was known for her kindness, social engagements, and her quiet strength. Their lives were a blend of public prestige and private comfort. Yet, even within such privilege, nothing can insulate a family from tragedy. The mansion, luxurious and imposing, became a prison of secrecy, tension, and ultimately, a scene of carnage. The discovery by Romy Reiner adds a layer of psychological complexity to the story. Imagine walking into the place that represents safety, only to find your parents lying lifeless, victims of an unimaginable act of violence. In her first interactions with police, she reportedly identified a dangerous family member, her own brother, as a potential suspect. Her intuition was terrifyingly accurate. The dynamics between siblings, the trust inherent in family bonds, and the shock of betrayal all converge in moments like these, leaving everyone involved reeling with disbelief, anger, and grief. What drives a person to commit such acts? Was it premeditation, a sudden emotional break, or a combination of long-standing psychological issues compounded by opportunity? Experts in criminal psychology often point to a mix of nature and nurture, environment, and personal choice, in cases of familial homicide. In Nick Reiner's case, Patterns of behavior emerged that, in retrospect, seemed like warning signs: mood swings, aggressive tendencies, and increasingly inappropriate and manipulative interactions with family members. Yet, these signs went unnoticed or were ignored until it was tragically too late. The FBI's involvement underscores the severity and complexity of this case. Beyond the murder charges, allegations regarding attempted forced intimate acts reveal a deeper, more insidious form of abuse. These allegations transform the narrative from a shocking homicide to a multi-layered story of betrayal, manipulation, and criminal behavior that challenges our understanding of familial boundaries. The investigation aims to unravel these layers, uncovering how much of this behavior was known, ignored, or concealed over time. While the public sees the aftermath through news headlines, social media posts, and official statements, the private reality is far more nuanced and devastating. The family, grappling with both grief and horror, faces the impossible task of reconciling love for a son with the monstrous acts he allegedly committed. Rob Reiner's experience, in particular, exemplifies this duality, mourning the loss of her parents while confronting the dark reality of her brother's actions. It is a human story as much as it is a criminal one that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about trust, perception, and the hidden layers of familial relationships. As investigators piece together the events leading up to that night, timelines are reconstructed, interactions are analyzed, and patterns of behavior are scrutinized. The narrative that emerges is not one of a sudden, inexplicable act, but rather the culmination of escalating tension, warning signs, and ultimately, an eruption of violence that no one could have anticipated fully. Each discovery adds another layer of complexity. Security footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence all contribute to painting a picture of what truly transpired within those walls. Public reaction has been immediate and intense. Social media platforms exploded with speculation, analysis, and expressions of grief and horror. News outlets ran continuous coverage, dissecting every known detail and seeking answers that may not yet exist. The juxtaposition of celebrity, privilege, and violence creates a narrative that is impossible to ignore, one that resonates because it forces audiences to confront the possibility that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in homes that seem perfect. But what truly makes this story compelling is the psychological and emotional undercurrent that runs through it. The intersection of familial love and betrayal, of trust and violence, challenges our understanding of human behavior. Nick Reiner's actions, if proven in court, represent one of the most extreme forms of familial betrayal imaginable. And yet, to fully comprehend the scope of this tragedy, one must examine not only the acts themselves, but the context, the family dynamics, the signs that were overlooked, and the environment in which this horror unfolded. As we prepare to delve deeper into this case, it's important to recognize the weight of the story we are about to tell. This is not simply a tale of crime. It is a study of human behavior under extraordinary circumstances, a glimpse into the darkest corners of what can happen when trust is violated in the most personal of ways. The events that unfolded in Brentwood are shocking, yes, but they are also a reflection of complex human emotions, decisions, and failings that can, tragically, culminate in acts that seem almost incomprehensible. So, what truly happened that night in the Reiner mansion? What drove Nick Reiner to commit the acts he is accused of, and how did the family dynamics contribute to this horrific outcome? In the chapters that follow, we will explore the history of the Reiner family, the psychological profile of Nick, the night of the murders in chilling detail, the discovery by Romy, the FBI's revelations, and the ongoing legal and emotional aftermath. Each chapter will reveal layers of complexity, contradictions, and human emotion, building toward a deeper understanding of how such a tragedy could unfold and why it resonates so powerfully with audiences around the world. And yet, even as we begin this exploration, one question lingers. Could anyone have truly predicted this outcome? Could the signs have been recognized earlier, or was this tragedy destined to occur, hidden behind the facade of normalcy and affluence? The answers are not simple. They are tangled in the lives, choices, and secrets of a family that seemed perfect from the outside. They say every family has secrets. Some are small, an argument over money, a lie to spare feelings. Others are darker, buried so deep that even the people involved may not fully understand them. The Reiner family, outwardly a picture of success, warmth, and influence, was no exception. To the public, Rob Reiner was Hollywood royalty. A man whose career spanned decades, from acting in classic television shows to directing blockbuster films that defined generations. His name carried prestige, his work earned awards, and his presence in Hollywood circles made him untouchable in many ways. Michelle, his wife of decades, was equally admired, graceful, poised, and often described by friends as the quiet glue that held the family together. Together, they seemed perfect. They seemed safe. They seemed invincible. But perfection is a dangerous mask. Behind the polished exterior of the Brentwood mansion, the Reiners were a family grappling with hidden tensions, unspoken resentments, and patterns that, in retrospect, may have been warning signs of a storm brewing far out of sight. The legacy of a family is never just in its public achievements. It's in the interactions between parent and child, the values passed down, the unspoken rules that govern behavior, and the emotional textures that shape identity. In the Reiners' case, decades of success and societal approval may have overshadowed subtle fractures within the family unit. Rob, with his towering career and relentless drive, could sometimes dominate conversations and decisions, unintentionally silencing the softer voices in the room. Michelle, ever accommodating, often absorbed tensions rather than confronting them, maintaining a calm and orderly home while perhaps masking her own frustrations. This dynamic, while outwardly stable, may have left cracks where resentment, insecurity, and unvoiced anger could grow unchecked. Nick Reiner, their only son living in the guest house, grew up observing this dynamic. To outsiders, he appeared like any other son of privilege, attending good schools, having access to opportunities, and enjoying the benefits of wealth. But access to wealth and status does not guarantee stability or mental health. For Nick, there were early indications that he struggled with managing emotions, understanding boundaries, and forming healthy relationships. Family friends later recalled moments where his behavior seemed aggressive or manipulative, though these incidents were often written off as quirks of youth. What no one could have known, or perhaps chose not to see, was that these behaviors were harbingers of a dangerous escalation. The mansion itself was more than a home. It was a physical manifestation of the family's public image. Pristine gardens, luxurious interiors, and security measures that reflected both wealth and privacy. Yet within this fortress of luxury, tensions simmered. The spaces that were meant to offer comfort also became arenas for conflict. Arguments, disagreements, and subtle power struggles took place behind closed doors. The Reiners were not immune to the challenges that plague every family. Differing expectations, generational conflicts, and the pressures of living up to public personas. But unlike many families, their private struggles were amplified by wealth, fame, and proximity to power, making it harder to address issues openly without fear of public scrutiny. Even with these underlying tensions, the Reiners maintained a carefully curated public image. Rob attended premieres, award shows, and charity events, always appearing composed and authoritative. Michelle was by his side, often engaging in philanthropic efforts, maintaining the appearance of a loving, supportive spouse. This image of stability created a dangerous illusion. It suggested that nothing could go wrong. Yet, the pressures of public life combined with private conflicts may have created an environment where unaddressed issues festered, laying the groundwork for future tragedy. The psychological patterns of the family are critical to understanding the eventual catastrophe. Children absorb the behaviors and emotional responses of their parents. In a family like the Reiners, where love and success were intertwined with strict expectations and subtle control, it's possible that Nick developed a skewed sense of entitlement, boundaries, and acceptable behavior. He witnessed interactions that reinforced certain power dynamics, perhaps internalizing ideas about control, dominance, and the consequences of defiance. At the same time, there were moments when he sought affection, validation, and attention, suggesting a complicated interplay between dependency and resentment, a volatile combination in any family dynamic. It is tempting to look back on a family tragedy and attempt to pinpoint a single cause, a single moment where everything went wrong. But real life is rarely that linear. In the Reiner's case, the tragedy was the product of years of interaction, subtle warnings, and missed opportunities to intervene. Every family disagreement, every ignored red flag, and every unaddressed emotional issue contributed to a slow-building tension that, on that fateful night, reached a catastrophic breaking point. The Reiner children were not isolated from the outside world. Romy, the daughter, was aware of some of the tensions within the family. She had witnessed arguments, inconsistencies in behavior, and at times, what she described later as dangerous tendencies in her brother. While these observations may have been dismissed at the time as exaggerations or sibling conflicts, they later proved chillingly accurate. Romy's role in discovering her parents' bodies highlights both the tragedy of the moment and the depth of insight she had into the potential for harm within her own family. Another layer of complexity lies in the interplay between personal accountability and familial influence. Nick's alleged actions were, of course, his own, yet they were shaped within a specific familial context, the expectations, boundaries, and interactions that defined his upbringing. Understanding this context does not excuse the behavior, but it provides insight into the psychological and emotional landscape that led to the murders. Experts in criminal psychology often emphasize the importance of environment in shaping behavior, particularly in cases involving extreme acts of violence within families. The Reiner family's story also underscores the difficulty of perceiving danger within one's own home. Safety is often assumed in spaces where love, trust, and familiarity reside. Yet, history is filled with cases where the most trusted individuals become sources of harm. In this sense, the Reiner's tragedy is both shocking and tragically familiar. It demonstrates that appearances can be deceiving, that familial bonds, no matter how strong on the surface, can hide dark currents, and that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one closest to you. Despite the tensions and warnings, the Reiners maintained their daily routines, unaware of the approaching storm. The mansion, which had hosted countless happy occasions, was also the setting for the private conflicts that would culminate in violence. Every hallway, room, and corner held memories, both joyful and fraught, making the night of the murders all the more devastating. It is within these walls that love and betrayal intersected, where privilege could not protect against the raw, destructive force of human behavior. As we examine the Reiner family legacy, it is impossible to ignore the duality that defined their lives: public admiration and private struggle, success and tension, love and unspoken resentment. These contradictions are at the heart of the tragedy, offering insights into how such a horrifying event could occur in a family that seemed perfect to the outside world. They remind us that every family has complexities, and in some cases, those complexities can escalate into outcomes that are both shocking and heartbreaking. And yet, even as we unpack the Reiner family's history, one question looms larger than any other. What was it about the combination of upbringing, personality, and circumstance that pushed Nick Reiner to commit an act so extreme, so incomprehensible? Understanding the family legacy is the first step, but it is only the beginning. The answers lie in the interplay between history and psychology, between unspoken tensions and the events of that fateful night. The full story of what happened and why unfolds in layers that reveal both the human capacity for darkness and the fragility of trust within a family. The stage is set, the characters introduced, and the underlying tensions made clear. The Reiner family legacy is one of achievement, love, and outward success. But beneath the surface, there were fractures that no one could ignore for long. The next chapter will take us deeper into the life of Nick Reiner, exploring the early signs of his troubling behavior, the psychological patterns that shaped him, and the moments that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the horrors that would soon unfold. What drives a son to commit acts of unimaginable violence against his own parents? It's a question that has haunted psychologists, criminal investigators, and families alike for decades. In the case of Nick Reiner, 32, the answer is not simple. It is a complex web of upbringing, personality, and psychological warning signs that, when combined, set the stage for tragedy. To understand Nick, we must look beyond the headlines and the arrest records. We must examine his life from childhood to adulthood, uncovering the patterns that slowly reveal the darker side of a son who, to the outside world, seemed like any other child of privilege. Nick was born into the public eye in a family that had long been in Hollywood. He had access to opportunities most people could only dream of: private schooling, connections to influential figures, and a home environment of comfort and luxury. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect setup for a happy, successful life. But luxury and privilege do not inoculate a person against psychological turbulence. In fact, they can sometimes amplify it, providing both the means and the insulation for unhealthy patterns to develop unchecked. From an early age, those closest to Nick noticed behavioral irregularities. Friends and family members recalled episodes of intense mood swings, moments of aggression that seemed disproportionate to the situation, and a tendency to manipulate circumstances to his advantage. These incidents were often dismissed, chalked up to adolescence, stress, or eccentricity, but they foreshadowed deeper issues that would eventually explode into tragedy. There was a sense, even then, that Nick was a child struggling to navigate boundaries, authority, and the complexities of familial relationships. Nick's relationship with his parents was complicated. Rob, a towering figure in Hollywood, was both admired and feared. He demanded excellence, and his expectations were high. For a young man growing up in such an environment, these pressures could be both motivating and suffocating. Michelle, meanwhile, offered warmth, but her approach was often one of accommodation rather than confrontation. She sought to maintain peace, to smooth over conflicts before they escalated, a tactic that may have inadvertently allowed certain behaviors to go unchecked. The combination of high parental expectations, coupled with a lack of firm boundaries at critical moments, created a volatile emotional landscape in which resentment and entitlement could thrive. As Nick entered his teenage years, the patterns of troubling behavior became more pronounced. School records and anecdotal reports indicate episodes of aggression and defiance that, while concerning, did not provoke significant intervention. He could be charming and articulate, capable of manipulating those around him to achieve his goals. But behind the charm lurked anger, frustration, and a sense of entitlement that, over time, became increasingly dangerous. Friends and distant relatives who interacted with him noted that his moods could shift without warning, and that he sometimes seemed preoccupied with controlling those closest to him. These early behavioral patterns are critical for understanding how a son can turn against his parents. Psychologists often point to the combination of genetic predisposition, environmental stressors, and early behavioral reinforcement as factors that contribute to extreme acts of violence. In Nick's case, he had access to means, isolation within the family dynamic, and unchecked behavioral tendencies. This combination created a perfect storm for escalation. Yet it is important to note that outward appearances remained largely intact. To the broader world, Nick appeared successful, composed, and ordinary. He attended social functions, maintained friendships, and engaged in activities typical of a man in his early 30s. This dichotomy between outward normalcy and private dysfunction is one of the most chilling aspects of his story. It allowed him to move within the world without drawing suspicion, even as the psychological pressures and manipulative tendencies intensified behind closed doors. The question of motive is always central in cases of familial homicide. Investigators and psychologists alike try to determine what drives a son to such extremes. Was it a momentary loss of control, a calculated plan, or a culmination of years of unresolved psychological issues? In Nick's case, evidence suggests that it was not a single catalyst, but rather a buildup of emotional, psychological, and relational stressors. These included resentment toward his parents, feelings of inadequacy, and possibly distorted perceptions of entitlement and control. Friends and acquaintances reported that Nick sometimes exhibited obsessive behavior, fixating on perceived slights or injustices, both real and imagined. This tendency, when combined with a lack of accountability and emotional regulation, can create a dangerous feedback loop. Minor frustrations escalate into anger. Anger turns into aggression, and without intervention or guidance, the aggression can manifest in catastrophic ways. Complicating matters further were allegations that would later emerge from FBI investigations, suggesting that Nick attempted to coerce Michelle into intimate acts. If true, this represents not only a profound moral and legal violation, but also a critical insight into the dynamics of control and boundary violations that had developed over time. Such behavior is often indicative of deeper psychological disturbances, including issues with empathy, impulse control, and respect for social and familial boundaries. It is also important to examine the role of isolation in Nick's descent. Living in the guest house on the Reiner estate, he maintained a degree of physical separation from the main household. While this arrangement might have seemed convenient, it may have inadvertently reinforced a sense of autonomy and detachment from the family's moral and social expectations. Isolation, particularly in a context of unresolved emotional conflict, can exacerbate tendencies toward manipulative, coercive, and ultimately violent behavior. As he reached adulthood, Nick's behavior reportedly became increasingly erratic. Small incidents of aggression, manipulation, and boundary pushing became more frequent and severe. Friends, family members, and casual acquaintances noticed changes, but few could predict the scale of the violence that would occur. The warning signs were there, scattered and subtle, like pieces of a puzzle that no one thought to assemble until it was tragically too late. In analyzing Nick's psychological profile, experts often emphasize the role of early environmental factors in shaping adult behavior. Patterns established in childhood, responses to stress, methods of conflict resolution, perceptions of authority, can solidify over time. In families like the Reiners, where outward appearances of stability mask underlying tension, problematic behaviors may be ignored, rationalized, or misinterpreted. This lack of early intervention can allow dangerous patterns to develop unchecked, increasing the risk of extreme outcomes. The story of Nick Reiner is also a cautionary tale about the challenges of perception. To the public, the Reiners were a model family, their successes and social contributions lauded and admired. Yet, the reality behind closed doors was far more complex, revealing the limits of what anyone, family, friends, or neighbors, could perceive. The dichotomy between public image and private reality is a recurring theme in tragic family narratives, emphasizing how appearances can be deceptive and how the darkest impulses may be hidden until they erupt in violence. Ultimately, Nick's descent is a multifaceted narrative of privilege, psychological instability, and relational dysfunction. It illustrates how unresolved emotional issues, when combined with access, isolation, and a lack of accountability, can culminate in catastrophic outcomes. Understanding Nick's journey does not excuse his actions, but it does provide a framework for analyzing how familial tragedies develop and how warning signs might be recognized before it's too late. And yet, even with this understanding, the horror of what happened that night remains incomprehensible. The seemingly ordinary son, who appeared to lead a normal life within a family of privilege, became the central figure in a tragedy that would devastate those closest to him. It is a stark reminder that human behavior is complex, unpredictable, and, at times, terrifying. The next chapter will take us inside the walls of the Reiner mansion, exploring the tensions, arguments, and dynamics that existed in the home leading up to the murders. It is within these private spaces that we begin to see how the pieces of this tragic puzzle fit together, and how the culmination of years of hidden anger and psychological disturbance would erupt in violence no one saw coming. A mansion worth $13.5 million can give the illusion of perfection. Marble floors gleam, chandeliers sparkle, gardens flourish, and security cameras quietly watch every entrance. To the outside world, the Reiner estate in Brentwood was a sanctuary, a symbol of wealth, success, and social prestige. But as any family with hidden fractures knows, luxury cannot shield a household from tension. Within these walls, beneath the pristine surfaces and curated public image, a simmering storm was building, and the ingredients for catastrophe were already in place. The Reiner household was complex, and its dynamics were layered. Rob Reiner, with his commanding presence and decades-long career, had an unmistakable authority in the home. He expected respect, compliance, and excellence, not just professionally, but personally, from his family. For those living under the same roof, His charisma was both magnetic and intimidating. Michelle, on the other hand, represented balance, warmth, and patience. She often acted as the emotional mediator, smoothing over conflicts that threatened to erupt. Together, they projected an image of stability and harmony, but appearances, as they often do, hid the truth. Inside the mansion, routines and rituals were more than mere schedules. They were markers of control and expectation. Mealtimes, family gatherings, even casual conversations carried unspoken rules. Any deviation, intentional or otherwise, could spark tension. While some conflicts were ordinary, disagreements over household matters or schedules, others carried deeper emotional weight, signaling unresolved issues between parents and children, particularly Nick. His behavior in these interactions often oscillated between affection and aggression, charm and manipulation. Observers would later describe a pattern of volatility that, over time, created an environment thick with anxiety, uncertainty, and unspoken dread. Nick's isolation in the guest house, ostensibly for privacy, further complicated matters. While many families separate young adult children for practical reasons, in this case, the separation created both distance and detachment from the household's moral and emotional norms. Nick could observe, manipulate, and interact with family members selectively, choosing moments to assert control or provoke tension. For a son already exhibiting troubling behavioral patterns, this arrangement created a dangerous dynamic: proximity without oversight, presence without accountability. Arguments in the mansion were not always loud or public. Many occurred in whispers, behind closed doors, or in private corners of the estate. A comment, a gesture, or a look could escalate into a confrontation, leaving emotional scars even if no physical altercation occurred. Michelle's approach to conflict often emphasized patience and diplomacy, yet this sometimes allowed Nick's escalating frustrations to fester. Rob's authoritative style, meanwhile, could unintentionally provoke defiance or resentment in a son struggling with boundaries. The interplay of these personalities created a tension that was invisible to outsiders but palpable within the walls of the home. Friends and family who visited the estate occasionally sensed these undercurrents. A sudden silence at the dinner table, a sharp retort disguised as humor, or a dismissive tone could signal unresolved conflict. Yet, because the family maintained a polished public image, these moments were often overlooked, rationalized, or dismissed. The dissonance between perception and reality is a common theme in familial tragedies. The closer you are, the more easily you can normalize warning signs until they culminate in disaster. Within the mansion, the hierarchy of control was subtle but unmistakable. Nick's actions, sometimes calculated, sometimes impulsive, tested limits. He challenged parental authority with passive-aggressive maneuvers, manipulation, or outright defiance. Each encounter was a psychological battle, a negotiation of power in which the stakes were both emotional and moral. Michelle often acted as the buffer, absorbing tension to prevent escalation, while Rob oscillated between firm guidance and exasperation. These dynamics, repeated over years, created a pressure cooker environment where small conflicts could spiral into explosive confrontations. Compounding this tension were allegations that Nick exhibited predatory and coercive behaviors. According to later FBI reports, he attempted to manipulate and control Michelle in deeply inappropriate ways. These behaviors, if verified, represent more than family dysfunction. They indicate a pattern of boundary violations that escalated over time. In retrospect, the signs were there: subtle acts of manipulation, obsessive behaviors, and moments of aggression that hinted at deeper issues. Yet, like many tragedies, the danger remained invisible until it manifested in violence. Even ordinary interactions were charged with complexity. A casual comment about finances, a disagreement over household decisions, or a perceived slight could trigger disproportionate responses. The mansion, designed to be a space of comfort, became a battleground of emotional and psychological conflict. The walls themselves bore witness to arguments, whispered threats, and tense negotiations that no outsider could see, yet which contributed to a growing pattern of instability. Understanding the Reiner family tensions also requires recognizing the role of privilege and expectation. Living in an affluent environment, surrounded by resources and status, does not protect against emotional dysfunction. In some cases, it amplifies it, allowing problematic behaviors to go unchecked or even enabling manipulative tendencies. For Nick, the combination of wealth, status, and lack of accountability created conditions in which resentment, entitlement, and psychological instability could fester, setting the stage for the tragic events to come. Neighbors and community members later described a sense of quiet tension at the estate. They noticed little. Perhaps a sudden argument through an open window or an unusual display of aggression. But these small observations were rarely connected to larger patterns. Like many family tragedies, the warning signs were scattered, easily dismissed, and misunderstood. The mansion appeared peaceful, but beneath its elegant facade, the dynamics were anything but calm. The night before the murders, these tensions reached a critical point. While the public will never know the full scope of what occurred behind those walls, investigators later pieced together evidence suggesting a combination of simmering anger, unaddressed grievances, and escalating psychological pressure. The interactions that night were not merely spontaneous. They were the culmination of years of unresolved conflict, manipulative behavior, and growing emotional instability. Every whispered argument, every ignored warning, and every subtle act of defiance played a role in what would become one of the most shocking family homicides in recent memory. And yet, even as tension mounted within the mansion, the outward appearance of normalcy persisted. Doors closed, lights dimmed, and the estate seemed as tranquil as ever. This duality, the coexistence of outward calm and inner chaos, is one of the most haunting aspects of familial violence. It serves as a reminder that danger often resides where we feel safest, and that appearances, no matter how polished, can be deceiving. Within this environment, the roles each family member played were crucial. Rob, the authority figure, attempted to maintain order and discipline. Michelle, the mediator, sought to preserve peace and protect the emotional integrity of the household. Nick, the son, navigated these dynamics in ways that increasingly challenged both authority and moral boundaries. The tension between these roles, the unspoken grievances, and the psychological undercurrents of control, resentment, and manipulation all coalesced in a perfect storm, one that no one could have predicted would erupt in violence. As investigators and psychologists later analyzed the scene, they noted the hallmarks of a family under extraordinary stress, suppressed anger, unspoken resentments, and complex relational patterns. These dynamics, invisible to the casual observer, contributed directly to the sequence of events that night. Understanding these tensions is essential to comprehending not just what happened, but why it happened, and how a seemingly normal family could descend into tragedy. The mansion, for all its beauty, became the stage for an unthinkable act. It is a stark reminder that wealth, privilege, and public perception cannot shield a family from the consequences of unaddressed emotional and psychological tension. In homes around the world, similar dynamics play out, though rarely with such catastrophic results. The Reiner story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, trust, and the hidden pressures that can exist even in the most outwardly perfect households. The next chapter will take us into the fateful night itself, reconstructing the events as they unfolded. From whispered arguments to the violent climax, we will examine the moments that led to the murders, the decisions made in split seconds, and the chaos that erupted within the mansion. It is a night that forever altered the Reiner family and shocked the world. Sunday night had begun like any other, or so it appeared from the outside. The Brentwood estate, a sprawling mansion perched in one of Los Angeles's most affluent neighborhoods, was quiet. Lights glimmered through curtains, casting soft halos on the immaculately kept grounds. But inside, beneath the veneer of normalcy, tension had been simmering for hours. The night that would change everything, that would shatter a family's world, was about to unfold. The Reiners had always maintained a routine, but that Sunday was different. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior. Nick lingering longer than usual in the guest house. Quiet conversations punctuated by sharp glances, subtle signs of agitation, hinted at a storm brewing beneath the surface. Anyone visiting the home that evening would have been oblivious to the undercurrents. Yet the tension was palpable to those within, a silent warning that something had shifted in the household's delicate equilibrium. Inside the main house, Rob and Michelle moved through their evening as if everything were normal. Dinner had been uneventful. Those small exchanges carried weight unseen by the casual observer. A look, a tone of voice, a hesitation in speech. These small signs of underlying discord would later be scrutinized by investigators searching for patterns, for the moment when everything tipped. What those investigators would piece together is chilling. A night of premeditation, manipulation, and ultimately, lethal violence that no one could have predicted from the outside. Nick Reiner, living in the guest house, had access to the entire estate. To an outsider, it was simply a space for a young adult to maintain independence. But on that night, the guest house became both a staging ground and a vantage point for the actions that would soon unfold. Reports suggest that his interactions with his parents escalated quickly from tense conversation to confrontation. The subtle psychological warfare of the past, small manipulations, boundary tests, and verbal provocations, culminated in a moment of explosive anger and violence. The sequence of events is still under investigation, and some details remain unconfirmed. However, forensic evidence, witness statements, and law enforcement accounts reconstruct a chilling timeline. At some point in the evening, Nick entered the main house. The encounter began as a conversation, but it quickly escalated. Words turned sharp, voices rose, and the emotional pressure that had been building for years reached a critical point. In a matter of moments, the murders themselves were brutal. Investigators report that both Rob and Michelle were stabbed multiple times, with the violence indicating both rage and personal targeting. This was not a random act. It was calculated, directed at the people closest to him. Each movement, each act of aggression, carried emotional weight. The betrayal inherent in a child attacking their parents magnified the horror exponentially. For Romy, discovering her parents' bodies moments later would be a moment of inconceivable shock, a rupture of the familial bond in its most extreme form. The immediate aftermath within the mansion was chaos. Blood, panic, and disbelief collided, creating a scene that no one could have imagined in a home that had once been a sanctuary. Romy, upon discovering the bodies, alerted authorities, but the damage had already been done. The emotional and psychological ramifications for the family would be profound and lasting. In that instant, a life of apparent normalcy was obliterated, replaced by grief, terror, and the unimaginable awareness that someone they had trusted most had turned violently against them. Police arrived quickly, alerted by Romy's call. The investigation began in earnest, with officers meticulously documenting the scene, securing evidence, and piecing together the sequence of events. Forensic analysis would later confirm the nature of the attacks, corroborating witness accounts and forming the basis for first-degree murder charges against Nick. The gravity of the situation was immediately clear. This was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a violent culmination of years of tension, manipulation, and unresolved psychological issues. Neighbors reported seeing emergency vehicles converge on the estate, a flurry of flashing lights and activity that drew attention and speculation. Word spread quickly through social media, and the story became a national sensation almost instantly. The combination of celebrity, wealth, and familial violence created a narrative that was impossible to ignore, capturing the attention of the public and the media alike. Yet for those closest to the family, the reality was far more devastating than any headline could convey. The FBI soon became involved, not only to corroborate the local investigation, but to examine allegations of coercion and boundary violations within the family dynamic. These findings added a disturbing layer to the narrative, suggesting that the violence was preceded by patterns of manipulation, abuse, and attempts to control. It painted a picture of a household in which personal boundaries had been violated repeatedly, escalating over time until they culminated in lethal aggression. Psychologists analyzing the events suggest that the escalation followed a recognizable pattern: long-standing tension, repeated minor conflicts, and the gradual erosion of emotional regulation. On the night of the murders, these factors converged, triggering a catastrophic response. In cases like this, experts emphasize that while opportunity and means are important, The underlying psychological and relational dynamics are often the decisive factors that lead to such extreme outcomes. The tragedy of that night extends beyond the immediate act of violence. It encompasses the rupture of trust, the collapse of familial bonds, and the profound emotional trauma inflicted on those left behind. Romy, as the first to witness the aftermath, experienced a psychological shock that would echo throughout her life. Friends and relatives would struggle with understanding how a family so outwardly normal could be the site of such horror. Moreover, the night of the murders illuminated the dangerous interplay of secrecy, privilege, and denial. Within the mansion, signs of escalating tension had existed for years, subtle warnings that, if heeded, might have prevented catastrophe. Yet in wealthy, high-profile families, these signs are often ignored, rationalized, or hidden to preserve appearances. The Reiner story starkly illustrates how unaddressed family dynamics can lead to devastating consequences, even in homes that appear outwardly perfect. As investigators continued their work, a clearer picture began to emerge. The violence was both personal and targeted. Every act of aggression carried emotional significance, revealing patterns of control, resentment, and betrayal. This was not an impulsive outburst devoid of context. It was the tragic endpoint of a long trajectory of psychological disturbance, relational tension, and missed intervention. The night of the murders also set in motion the legal and social aftermath that would dominate the Reiner family's life for years to come. Nick's arrest that evening marked the beginning of a criminal process that would expose hidden family dynamics, reveal shocking allegations, and challenge the public's perception of a family they had admired for decades. The combination of celebrity, wealth, and extreme violence ensured that the case would receive intense scrutiny, both from legal authorities and the media, amplifying the impact of the tragedy. Even now, as details emerge piecemeal, the horror of that night remains difficult to fully comprehend. The convergence of opportunity, psychological instability, and relational tension created a scenario in which the unimaginable became reality. The Reiner mansion, once a place of familial comfort, had become a site of profound betrayal and loss. No one can truly prepare for the moment when everything they thought they knew about their life, their family, and their safety is suddenly shattered. For Romy Reiner, 27, that moment came on a Sunday night in Brentwood, within the walls of the mansion she had grown up in, a place that should have been a sanctuary. What she found that evening would leave an indelible mark on her life, redefine her understanding of family, and trigger a cascade of events that the world would soon hear about in horror. Romy had always been observant, sensitive to the emotional currents running through her family. She noticed the subtle tension between her parents and her brother Nick, although, like many, she struggled to understand the depth of it. That evening, she returned to the mansion, perhaps with routine intentions, checking in on her parents, enjoying a quiet moment in the house she had always associated with comfort and safety. But the air felt different, charged with an intangible foreboding that prickled her instincts. Something was off, though she could not yet articulate what. Walking through the familiar hallways, Romy was struck by a silence that felt unusual for the Reiner home. No laughter, no background hum of television or conversation, no domestic noises she had come to associate with comfort. Only stillness. It was the kind of silence that hints at hidden turmoil, the kind that sets the mind racing with questions. Where is everyone? What has happened? Her first instinct was to call out to her parents, softly at first, then louder, her voice echoing in the spacious rooms. The silence remained. Then she saw them. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner, her parents, lying lifeless in the home she had always associated with warmth, love, and safety. The shock was immediate, visceral. The instinct to scream, to flee, to seek help, collided with the surreal disbelief of what she was witnessing. Romy later described the moment as a blur, a distortion of time in which every sensation was amplified and distorted: the sight, the smells, the sudden realization that her family had been irrevocably shattered. Her first thoughts were practical, driven by a mix of fear, grief, and survival instinct. She needed to call for help. But even as she reached for the phone, a deeper awareness emerged, a chilling recognition of who might be responsible. Nick. Her brother, living in the guest house, had long been the source of tension and concern. She recalled incidents, small but unsettling, that had hinted at his capacity for manipulation and aggression. Her intuition, sharp and immediate, whispered that the danger had come from within. With trembling hands, Romy dialed emergency services, reporting not only the horrific scene she had discovered, but also her suspicion about a dangerous family member. She described Nick as someone who should be considered a suspect, and her warning would prove crucial in guiding law enforcement's immediate response. Even in the midst of incomprehensible grief, she demonstrated presence of mind, clarity, and decisiveness, a reflection of both her character and the urgency of the situation. The arrival of law enforcement transformed the mansion into a controlled zone, a space of investigation and forensic analysis. Officers documented every detail, collected evidence, and secured the perimeter. But even as the professionals took charge, the emotional reality of the scene remained. Romy's experience, the shock, the betrayal, and the raw grief, highlighted the profound human consequences of familial homicide. It is one thing to read about crime in the abstract. It is another to witness it firsthand, to confront the visceral reality of violence perpetrated by someone you trusted implicitly. Investigators quickly began reconstructing the timeline, piecing together movements, interactions, and potential triggers. Romy's statements provided critical insight into the dynamics of the family and the behavior of her brother. Her observations of tension, arguments, and past incidents allowed investigators to contextualize the violence, moving beyond the immediate act to understand the psychological and relational factors that had led to it. In essence, her testimony became a key element in unraveling not just the crime itself, but the hidden family dynamics that had set the stage for it. The shockwaves of Romy's discovery extended far beyond the mansion. News outlets rapidly reported on the incident, highlighting the arrest of Nick Reiner and the brutal nature of the murders. Social media erupted with speculation, grief, and condemnation. Public fascination, fueled by the family's celebrity status and the horrific nature of the crime, collided with genuine human empathy for Romy's unimaginable loss. For her, however, the public attention was secondary to the immediate trauma of the experience. Losing both parents in a single night, at the hands of her own brother, in a place that had always represented safety and love. Emotionally, the discovery forced Romy into an impossible position. She was simultaneously a witness, a grieving daughter, and a conduit for law enforcement. The weight of responsibility, to provide accurate information, to navigate the shock, and to confront the reality of her brother's actions, was immense. Psychologists studying similar cases note that survivors in such situations often experience intense guilt, questioning what they could have done differently, whether warning signs were missed, and how to reconcile love for a family member with the reality of their actions. Romy's role embodies these dualities, the collision of grief, horror, and moral reckoning. The psychological impact of discovering her parents' bodies cannot be overstated. Witnessing violence perpetrated by someone so close creates a unique trauma, often characterized by a mix of betrayal, confusion, and intense emotional distress. Romy's experience illustrates this phenomenon, the simultaneous processing of grief for her parents and the horror of her brother's actions. In such circumstances, the mind struggles to reconcile familial bonds with the stark reality of extreme violence, leading to complex emotional outcomes that can persist long after the immediate events have concluded. Even as the investigation progressed, Romy had to navigate the immediate practicalities of survival and cooperation with authorities. Law enforcement conducted interviews, collected statements, and coordinated with the FBI to examine the allegations of coercion and abuse that had surfaced. Her insights were invaluable, not only for understanding the specific events of that night, but also for revealing the broader patterns of family tension, manipulation, and escalating behavioral issues that had culminated in tragedy. Her discovery also had a profound symbolic impact. In a family home that had been a sanctuary, the presence of death and betrayal transformed the space into a site of trauma. The mansion, once a symbol of stability and achievement, became a visual and emotional marker of the consequences of unaddressed family dysfunction. For Romy, every room, hallway, and corner carried layers of memory intertwined with grief, guilt, and disbelief. The physical environment mirrored the psychological devastation she was experiencing, emphasizing the intimate and devastating nature of familial violence. The public narrative of that night, shaped by media coverage and social attention, cannot fully capture the human dimension of Romy's experience. While headlines focus on the crime, the arrest, and the shocking allegations against Nick, the reality of what she endured. The immediate confrontation with violence, the emotional upheaval, and the moral reckoning offers a deeper understanding of the personal toll. It is a reminder that behind every crime reported in the media lies a web of human experience, trauma, and enduring consequences. As law enforcement pieced together the events, Romy's observations provided clarity and direction. Her intuition about Nick's potential involvement, combined with her detailed recounting of prior incidents, allowed authorities to prioritize the investigation and focus on critical evidence. In essence, her presence and insight prevented further delay in apprehending a suspect and ensured that the path to justice began immediately. Yet, even with her cooperation and the swift response of authorities, the emotional impact of discovery is irreversible. Romy's life had been irrevocably changed, and the challenges of processing such trauma are ongoing. Experts in familial homicide note that the aftermath of discovery often includes a complex mix of grief, anger, guilt, and confusion, compounded by the societal and legal scrutiny that follows. Romy's experience exemplifies these dynamics, highlighting both the personal and public dimensions of tragedy in high-profile family cases. The discovery by Rob Reiner also set the stage for understanding the full scope of Nick's behavior. Subsequent FBI investigations and forensic analyses revealed patterns of coercion, boundary violations, and escalating aggression, all of which contextualized the night's events within a broader history of familial dysfunction. Romy's early recognition of danger, her decisive reporting to authorities, and her insights into her brother's behavior became pivotal in shaping the trajectory of the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the public understanding of the case. The next chapter will explore the FBI's revelations and the disturbing allegations they uncovered. These findings, which include attempts to manipulate and coerce Michelle Reiner in deeply inappropriate ways, add a layer of horror to an already tragic narrative. They illuminate the psychological dynamics at play, revealing not only the events of the night of the murders, but the patterns of control, manipulation, and abuse that had been developing for years. When the FBI became involved in the Reiner case, it signaled the gravity and complexity of the situation. This was no ordinary domestic homicide. Beyond the horrifying act of violence that claimed the lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner, investigators were confronted with evidence suggesting a pattern of predatory and coercive behavior by Nick Reiner toward his mother. The allegations were shocking, deeply disturbing, and, in many ways, almost unimaginable, attempts to force intimate acts on a parent by her own son. As law enforcement pieced together the facts, a larger and darker picture of the Reiner family dynamics began to emerge, one that cast long shadows over the events of that fateful night. The FBI's investigation was meticulous. They interviewed friends, relatives, household staff, and anyone who had insight into Nick's behavior. They examined digital communications, social interactions, and previous incidents that, while minor on their own, collectively revealed disturbing patterns. These behaviors were not isolated, impulsive moments. They indicated a consistent disregard for boundaries and a troubling fascination with control and manipulation. Experts reviewing the case noted that such patterns often escalate when left unaddressed, particularly in environments where the individual has both opportunity and a lack of accountability. Among the most unsettling findings were allegations that Nick had repeatedly attempted to coerce Michelle Reiner into sexual acts. While the full details remain sealed in ongoing investigations and court documents, the implications are horrifying: a violation of the most sacred familial bonds, an abuse of trust that cannot be overstated. Psychologists reviewing the case describe such behavior as indicative of deep psychological disturbance, combining elements of narcissism, boundary confusion, and a willingness to exploit those closest to him for personal gratification. The FBI reports also revealed a history of manipulative behavior beyond the alleged coercion. Nick had reportedly sought to control household dynamics, monitoring interactions, influencing conversations, and exploiting perceived weaknesses in family members. These behaviors, subtle to outsiders but evident to those within the household, created an environment in which fear, anxiety, and tension were constant. Friends and relatives described Nick as charming and articulate in public, masking the darker impulses that manifested in private. This duality is a hallmark of manipulative individuals, the ability to appear normal or even admirable, while engaging in coercive or abusive behavior behind closed doors. Investigators examined previous incidents where Nick's behavior had raised concerns. Reports indicated episodes of aggression, obsessive tendencies, and boundary pushing that were often dismissed as eccentricity or misinterpreted as youthful rebellion. In retrospect, these were clear warning signs, overlooked or minimized because they did not result in overt harm at the time. Law enforcement and psychological experts agree that patterns like these, when repeated over time, often precede more severe acts of violence or abuse, particularly in the absence of intervention. The revelations shocked both the public and those who knew the family personally. Rob and Michelle Reiner had cultivated an image of stability and grace, a household seemingly protected by love, wealth, and status. Yet the FBI findings exposed the stark contrast between public perception and private reality. This duality, the outward appearance of perfection and the hidden existence of fear, manipulation, and abuse, is a common theme in familial homicides, particularly in high-profile cases where